And joining us now on the debate in Montreal, Quebec, Afra Jalabi, a Syrian-Canadian activist and a member of the opposition Syrian National Council. In the nation's capital, Christopher Assad, president of the Coalition of Arab Canadian Professional and Community Associations. In Hamilton, Ontario, Atif Kaboursi, professor emeritus in the Department of Economics at McMaster University. And with us here in studio, Besma Momani, senior fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation, and Omar Al-Gabra, former Liberal Member of Parliament for Mississauga-Arundel from the years 2006 to 2008. And we're happy to have you two here in our studios and our other three guests on the line from Points Beyond. I want to start perhaps, Afra, with you and get you to just share with us, because of course reports coming out of Syria are very sketchy right now. What's your understanding of the situation in Syria right now?
Well, the situation is really terrible. Only today the Red Cross was allowed. For the last 4 weeks, the Syrian forces have been shelling residential areas in the city of Homs, particularly the neighborhood of Baba Amr. Yesterday, the severely tortured body of a 12-year-old boy was delivered back to his family by the security forces by the name Mustafa Jarkas. Today, we're getting reports that about 42 tanks are heading to the north of Syria, to the city of Saraqib, to crush also the opposition. The Syrian forces have been using terms like cleansing. They're moving from neighborhood, from city to city, in order to crush what they think is something that is doable when it comes to the Syrian revolution and the movement for basic human rights, for civil rights in Syria, because the Syrian people have not had those for the last 42 years.
Okay, let me go to Christopher Assad. You've obviously been in touch with your sources on this. What can you add to our understanding of the facts on the ground right now?
Indeed, Steve, it is quite evident that the insurgency in Syria is an armed insurgency that is supported by foreign powers, and the armed forces are doing nothing except attempting to bring back law and order to the restive areas, and there are not too many. There are non-verifiable and outright lies about children being massacred, like the one that Afra just mentioned. I don't think she or anybody else can prove that the Syrian army has any interest in killing 12 years old, simply because I don't think 12 years old are politicized or are carrying arms. The Syrian armed forces are very much trying to fight Al-Qaeda elements and other terrorist organizations that have infiltrated the Free Syrian Army, and that is causing an armed rebellion in the country.
Atif Kaboursi, your understanding of things, please.
Yeah, well, there is no question here the Syrian quest for freedom and democracy are legitimate and just. What is probably unjust and unacceptable is this militarization. It started as a popular uprising and soon deteriorated. There is no question that in the beginning, perhaps the regime used excessive force, but if you look at the two premises of whatever is international law about the situation, necessity, proportionality, these have shifted. Today, what the Syrians really face on the ground is a military uprising that is supported by foreign powers and neighboring states. The situation can far be preferred to be resolved in a peaceful, negotiated way. There is no benefit to anybody in Syria. It's disheartening to see the destruction and bloodshed. And there is no alternative than to bring all the parties together in a way that would bring a peaceful resolution. The Arab League sent its monitors. They were the only boots on the ground. They were the only eyes on the ground. And unfortunately, the Arab League, but particularly under the pressure from Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Gulf, have dismissed and have revoked this presence. It could have really worked to something far better than what we're seeing today.
Besma Momani, we've already seen one point of departure in this debate on our program today. Do you believe the Assad government is capable of torturing and or killing 12-year-old children? Is that part of their MO?
Well, I mean, in terms of, regime and its security apparatus, it's done this before, obviously, and there's a history of violence there. But more importantly, the issue is here, there are some atrocities being committed, and we need to have some sort of investigation into the matter. I mean, the regime may continue the line that it is dealing with an insurgency, and absolutely, I think no one could ignore the fact that there has been a militarization and securitization of the protest movement. But the point here is that we need to allow some sort of objective third-party established group to come in and see exactly what's happened.
Who do you suggest? Red Cross, for example?
I think the Red Cross would be great. I mean, the fact that we have not been able to have the Red Cross come into a little community of, Hamza has noted, to handle some of this humanitarian crisis is an example. But the fact that they were isolated from coming in for several days is really problematic of the way this regime is not only locked down the citizens inside these individual areas, but more importantly, they've locked down information. And if we really want to have a truth sort of fact-finding kind of mission, let's allow all the monitors to come in and properly source things. And I think we'll see a very different picture than the regime is painting to us.
Omar, we should just point out you're of Syrian background, which is one of the reasons we wanted to have you here today. What's your understanding of how things are right now?
Well, the uprising in Syria started a year ago, and a backdrop of Arab Spring all over the Arab world after 42 years of total political and social suffocation. Most of us have been surprised why it took this long, but it happened, and unfortunately, eventually, the militarization of the uprising is beginning. It has begun a few months ago, and the regime is obviously interested in confusing facts on the ground. That's why there's no media. That's why the International Red Cross has limited movement. It serves their interest to confuse people and to confuse the media about what's going on.
Well, lest we confuse our viewers about Christopher's background, we should just say, Christopher, for the record, you're not related to, even though you have the same last name as, the current head of Syria. Having said that, how confident are you? Well, actually, let me go back, because I just heard you in my ear say, not true, when Omar was giving that last answer. What do you want to dispute there?
I simply want to say that information is very much available. RT is on the ground. Other media organizations, probably over 120 media outlets are on the ground in Syria. If Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and the BBC is not on the ground, or the CNN is not on the ground, that doesn't make that there is no information. There is information available.
That's not true.
Yes, it is. If you go to the net, you will be able to see a lot of...
Is that why Mary Colvin was killed?
Excuse me.
Was targeted
sorry,
and
Afra,
with the young camera
forgive
person?
me. I can't have two people speaking at once. So, Christopher, you finish your answer, please, and then we'll get Afra.
Thank you. But bringing up Mary Colvin with a nail in the skull, she died because of an IED. She was not killed by the shelling of the Syrian armed forces. Mary Colvin has got a coroner's report now. The autopsy report is attached to her corpse and is in the hands of the Polish embassy in Damascus. So stop lying, Afra. And the information is available. It's all over the net. It doesn't mean, CNN does not give the added credibility by not being there. I mean, there is a million media outlets there that you could go and reference.
Okay, let me jump into this place. Forgive me, Christopher. Let me jump in at this place and also say we're not going to call anybody liars on this program either. We're going to have a civilized discussion about this. But Afra, you clearly disagree with Christopher about some of those points.
I mean,
what's your issue?
Yeah, of course. And the way he's calling me while we're in Canada, you could imagine what will be done to me if I go to Syria. I mean, I've been on the wanted on the wanted list. No, I didn't call you that. I remember what I said at the time. I said it was shameful that we find people in Canada who are standing by this fascist regime that is bent on killing civilians. And I will say the same thing. I am very saddened. I am very saddened that you stand by a fascist regime that has been using words like cleansing. The Syrian regime has been using words like cleansing of entire neighborhoods in Syria. Because they're terrorists, right? Because they're terrorists. No, they're not terrorists. They are civilians. They are protecting their
Stand by, everybody.
Look,
I want to give others.
I let you continue. Let me continue. I let you continue.
Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization.
You know
Excuse me.
You know who actually?
I'm going to ask for.
Is a terrorist organization.
I want to talk. Yeah,
I'm going to
I will
ask
speak
the
to the
director
point
in the
about
control room
Al-Qaeda. Can I speak
to cut
the
the
point
mics,
about
please,
Al-Qaeda?
because I can't understand anything when both are speaking at once. Omar, you were listening in. You wanted to say.
You know, I think it's an endless circle. Who did what? Let's get to the facts. Are the Syrian people living in a democratic, liberal, civil society where they're allowed to exercise their political opinions and practice whatever political ideology they have? It's a simple answer, and I don't know if anybody here will dispute that. No, no. Are the Syrian military forces attacking certain neighborhoods? Yes, these are facts. We can be confused with who did what, and I think it's meant to divert the issue or distract us. The Syrian population, just like any other population, any human being, deserve to have the power and the ability to define their own destiny.
Okay, let me follow up with Besma on one thing here. Stand by 1 second. Most of what I've seen coming out of Syria is what I guess would be called amateur video. I haven't seen a lot of BBC or CNN or that kind of thing. What's your understanding of how accurate a picture we're getting of what's coming out of Syria?
Well, we're not getting enough images. You know, I think the narrative of the government has often been that these are insurgents. But I think that really confuses, frankly, the history of what happened here, which was they started out very peacefully, and it was instigated by the brutality of the regime going and taking children from the schools of Daraa, who wrote down the infamous words of down with the regime. It was propelled further because of the taking of one child, Hamza, who was brutalized, castrated, and all of that, I think, is what allowed this protest movement to really build up steam. So I don't think that we can really change history here, and unfortunately there is a lot of propaganda. There's a lot of propaganda on all sides, but more importantly, if the truth is there, then allow the media groups to go through. I mean, frankly, even RT, I'm really sorry, I mean, it's probably
the worst. Just tell everybody what RT is.
RT is Russia Today, and I watch that channel endlessly. I mean, you couldn't get more, frankly, third-rate journalism. I mean, it really is quite poor. The kind of experts that they bring on there to sort of not only justify the regime's actions, but frankly to comment are ridiculous. So I mean, let's be frank. There is truth out there, but let them all in to come out.
Yes, Atif, come in, please.
Yeah, I think we have built here a narrative as if it is the regime versus people. I think this is not an accurate one. And we need to scrutinize these types of narratives. I would really like to tender here a situation in which many of us are not with the regime. They're with the legitimate demands for the people. But we can't possibly sit back and see that Syria is going to be splintered. Syria is going to rile under a very brutal sanctions that would affect only the people and not the regime. That there would be a chance here to bring certain forces that would be totally anti-democratic by any standards, Al-Qaeda and other groups that seem to have really sprung on the field. There is no question about it here. We don't have as many foreign media on, but there is quite a bit of news coming out. And exactly what I said before, the chance that we really had with the Arab monitors who were conveying a very good picture, actually, on what is taking place and being objective, and being scuttled.
Okay, let me ask a question now, and Christopher, I'll go to you first on this. This is a question that I suspect policymakers all over the world are asking themselves right now, which is about the opposition. Is it organized? Is it united enough to be able to present a viable alternative to the Assad government? What's your view on that?
Well, after 1 year of bloodshed, it is now evident that the opposition cannot even get its act together in any way, shape, or form. It is splintered, it is fractured. 2 days ago, I was talking to our Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he stated that this actually does pose a problem because it is a very, very difficult situation when you have to find one single unified opposition. There are 20, 30, God knows how many organizations. Most of them are outside the country and basically led by the Muslim Brotherhood.
So your view at the moment is they are not united and not viable, therefore, at the moment?
Absolutely, absolutely not. You know, for somebody to get $20 million to become an intellectual criminal and lead the SNC, I don't think they will ever have any track on the ground in Syria.
Okay, let me get Afra. So you've made a comment. Stand by. You've made a comment about the Syrian National Council. Sure. It's only fair that I get her to respond to that. Afra, if you would, could you tell us whether you believe the opposition at the moment is viable and united enough to present an alternative to the Assad regime?
Yeah, but let me clarify one thing first. Professor Burhan Ghalioun, who is the head of the Middle Eastern Studies Department at the Sorbonne, who is now the head of the Syrian National Council, has not received the amount of money that Christopher probably wishes he could get in order to lead this opposition. People are leading the opposition out of personal conviction and out of care for human rights and out of care for human values.
Having said that, are they a viable alternative?
Let me get back to the issue. Yeah, of course the Syrian opposition, I find it somewhat offensive when people discuss the unity of the Syrian opposition. I don't think we find people in Canada, NDP officials and conservative officials embracing. There are always tensions. It's natural in any opposition groups in any country in the world. What is amazing is that different groups in Syria have come together in order to create an umbrella organization that's called the Syrian National Council. And it's not headed by the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. No, that's not true. We have people from the far left to the far right and a lot of groups in between. In fact, it has groups from the Alawite sect, it has groups from Druze, it has group even from with a Christian background. It's a diverse group. It's a diverse group. It's a diverse group. And let's not forget that Syria, the Syrian regime, left no margin for any political activism for the last 42 years. So what is happening is almost close to a miracle that you still have some brain cells in the Syrian society. There was a great deal of damage to intellectuals and to human rights lawyers in Syria who could not do any sort of activism.
Okay, stand by, everybody. Stand by. No, just a minute. Just a minute. Stand by, everybody. I want to get, again, in the interest of equal time, let's get into the studio here. I want to hear for Besma and then Omar on this. I think Afra makes a good point insofar as the opposition doesn't have to be united, but they do have to be viable. In Canada, we don't have united opposition, but we do know that the folks who sit opposite the government, if push came to shove, could replace the government. That's the way it works here. Yeah. Do we have that situation in Syria today?
No, to be frank, we don't. And I don't think that even the SNC necessarily can claim that it's completely got all diverse views of the opposition completely under its umbrella. It's a work in progress. But I think that we're putting too much pressure on the Syrian opposition to be something like akin to the Libyan National Council, which we saw as being a success story in some way.
Because they're not there yet? Is that what you're saying?
They're not there yet. And you know, it spent 40 years, 42 years in the opposition, which wasn't even in existence, because the regime didn't even allow that kind of opposing voice to exist and flourish. So for it to be even this far advanced today, I think is pretty impressive.
So Omar, as policymakers around the world consider whether or not to assist, to arm, to put troops, in league with the opposition, is the opposition at a point where that kind of assistance would make sense?
I think a lot of, I'm against militarizing the opposition. Even though it's their right, frankly, but I'm not in favor of it. Just because I think that's exactly what the regime wants. They can overpower the opposition and point at them and saying, look, we told you there are terrorist groups and using violence, and there we are, therefore we get to do whatever we want with them. So I'm not in favor of that. And I want to echo what Afra and Besma just said. The burden should not be on the opposition. The burden should be on the regime that has been in power for 42 years. That it's incumbent on it to protect its citizens and nurture them. So I think, back to your question about international assistance, I think if there's a way to work with the opposition on nurturing democratic institutions, democratic practices. Let's not forget there is no culture of democracy in Syria whatsoever. And sometimes they sit around a meeting and they don't know how to raise a point of order sometimes. Like, it's simple mechanics that people are learning as we speak today.
Beauchene's parliamentary procedure has not made it to Syria yet, I think is what I hear you saying. Okay, Atif, please. Atif.
All right. First of all, they're not going to get together. There are real substantive and serious differences between the opposition forces. The domestic, the national one inside has called for no intervention from outside, has rejected militarization, has rejected sanctions. These are people who have really been on the ground. They're incredibly credible people. I mean, has names like Michel Kilo, has been imprisoned for so many times by the regime. Haytham Manna, a very respected person. Al-Ladiqi, and Arif Dalila, an economist that I know fairly well, and I've really been involved in helping him get out of prison at one time. This is a very legitimate opposition and more power, and if the regime was to be more careful and more accommodating and more flexible, this is one that you could work with. It has always been very adamant about internalizing and keeping things within Syria. The SNC, unfortunately, Afra, whatever you think, has delegitimized itself for calling for military intervention, for asking for arms smuggling as if it has not been done yet, and for sanctions. You know fairly well that these sanctions are going to hit and going to impose incredible pain on the people of Syria and on the regime. And this is a time perhaps where the SNC must declare its neutrality and not being in cahoots with some of the most reactionary forces of the Arab world.
Okay, stand by, please. Atif, stand by. Let me get, since you've made a claim against the SNC, we should give Afra a chance to respond. Go ahead, please.
Yes, well, you know, people are always accusing the SNC of not being divided or not having an agreement among its members. And the reason it's not because of ideological differences or sectarian differences, but rather because of these precise challenges that is facing the Syrian people. Many of the rebels on the ground have been demanding for the militarization, for arming the opposition groups, especially the soldiers who have defected from the army and who have sworn allegiance and sworn to protect the Syrian people. So there has been somewhat of a debate, which I think would happen naturally in any society. If you have tanks in on Sherbrooke Street here in Montreal, and you're somewhere else and you're hearing that thousands of Canadians are being slaughtered, then, you know, there would be a debate of the best ways to deal with the situation. There are people among, you know, in the Syrian National Council, including me, who are not crazy about the arming of the opposition groups. But can I continue my point? But
Please.
at least we have different views in the Syrian National Council, and we are coming together and we debate them like rational beings. Whereas on the Syrian regime side, you have slogans like Al-Assad aw la ahad, which means Assad or no one. And the security forces leave on the walls a graffiti that says Al-Assad aw nahriq al-balad, Assad or we burn the country. So basically, an entire nation has been collapsed into a personality cult and into the persona of the president, and no other person is allowed to have a human value. At least we are different people coming together in the SNC.
I'd like to hear from
not
Christopher now, please.
worshipping one person.
Christopher?
Yes, Steve. This is not about the person of the president. It is definitely not.
It is.
This is about a whole sovereign country that is being attacked from inside and outside by terrorist organizations and armed rebels. Okay? The majority of Syrians do not want any violence. The fact that they participated in a democratic process recently, which is the constitutional referendum, is a good indicator that yes, they can build democratic institutions. Yes, they can build democratic processes. Yes, they can take the initiative and fix the problems that gave rise to this uprising. However, the uprising itself right now is not any longer about Assad. It is about fracturing the country and making it a puppet state to NATO and the GCC coalition. This is rejected by the overwhelming majority of the Syrian people. We do have an upcoming elections. We are calling for dialogue. We are calling for transparent and democratic elections, supervised, by the way, by international observers. And it's the ballot box that's going to determine what plan Syria is going to implement.
Okay,
It's
stand
not
by,
up to
stand by,
yes.
stand by 1 second. Again, I want to hear now from the studio. Besma, I'd like your view on the concerns that some have expressed that if the Assad regime falls, you will see sectarian violence in Syria that will be a horror show, and they don't want to see that. How legitimate are those concerns?
Well, I mean, you know what, we can't ignore those concerns. I mean, they are a concern, and clearly the Iraqi scenario is something that is still so fresh in the minds and is a fresh wound for so many people in the region. So nobody wants to see a repeat of that. But I think more importantly, the question is, what's the alternative?
Well, is it a legitimate option to keep the regime in place?
I think it's too late. I mean, he has done so much harm. There is so much pain and suffering throughout the country. You know, there are 80,000 refugees, Syrian refugees in Jordan. There's perhaps 20,000 in Turkey. There's, you know, because of constricted borders, we have about 2,000, maybe even more, unknown sort of how many have gone through illegally into Lebanon. I mean, there is already a refugee crisis. To say that things can go back to normal and that now let's have people go to the ballot box is quite laughable after the pain and suffering that these people have incurred.
Allow them.
Stand by, Omar.
Allow them.
You know, while I'm against military intervention, but I would never call anybody who's calling for military intervention to have an illegitimate point of view, because it is a legitimate point of view, and I think people are entitled to have their opinion. And I think what's missing in this debate sometimes, and I do agree, I am concerned about what the aftermath, what will happen. But I don't think this is a political debate. What's lacking is the sense of urgency to what's happening on the ground today. Military of a government is shelling and detaining people without warrant, torturing people.
But Omar, if you're not prepared to see international intervention, how are you going to stop that?
Well, first of all, I am in favor of sanctions. I am in favor of completely cutting off political and diplomatic embassies and relationship with Syria. Once some elements of the Syrian regime begin to see that the survivability of this regime is almost near nil, I expect the regime will collapse on itself.
Well, let's see. Afra, can I ask you whether or not you think a Libyan-style solution, NATO planes dropping bombs, that kind of thing, is that something you'd like to see?
You see, I mean, the reason I'm talking about collapsing the whole identity of the Syrian people into one persona is really central to this debate. Because if we do not collapse and dwarf the Syrian people into the person of Bashar al-Assad, we will be able to have a peaceful transition. Because if he accepts to step down and the family steps down, then we would be able to have a peaceful transition, and it would spare us from the kind of the Libyan scenario, or also the dead and that Gaddafi found. I mean, both of us are at a locked end here.
Let me get Christopher. All right, stand by. Let me get Christopher on this.
We need to be rational.
Let me get Christopher and then Atif on this, please. You've said that if the family stepped down, relinquished power, that would avoid a great deal of bloodshed. First Atif and then Christopher. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, I would comment on this, but I'm completely convinced that the fresh precedent and the terrible developments in Libya and Iraq are very much a very strong and powerful argument that many Syrians are completely worried, and we should take these concerns into account. I am also completely convinced that what is here, and we cannot dismiss this or don't give it enough weight. They have, particularly the GCC and the French, the Americans, the Israelis, the Turks, everybody else, they're trying to change the geopolitical balance in the region. The targeting of Syria is not unrelated to targeting of Iran. This is basically a situation in which they want to isolate Iran and think that the pressure they can put on Syria, any change in Syria, would be a major catastrophic result for the Iranians.
Okay, Atif, can I just understand, do you think there are no human rights issues in this case at all?
No, there are human rights issues, but they're playing with the Syrians as pawns in this major grand games. And this is really where it is quite sinister. I am definitely for the human rights and for the sanctity of life in Syria, and for greater democracy and for greater participation.
So how do you want to make that happen?
Well, it would come through dialogue, through debate, through opening the system. The Constitution, if anyone bothered to read it, has already brought incredible number of changes, some of which I don't like. They have to keep the president Muslim, and they have to keep Sharia as a major source of this, and they leave all juridic personal things to the religious sects. There are certain things I don't like, but it calls Syria a democratic republic and want to move in that direction.
Okay, let me get Christopher, please. Let me get Christopher on the issue of whether or not, if the Assad family left, that might avoid sectarian violence and bloodshed. What do you think of that option?
Absolutely not. It is not, again, it is not about the Assad family. This is about dialogue. It's about, the Russians and the Chinese already brought pressure to bear on the government to sit down and agree to dialogue between it and the opposition group inside Syria. Many of the opposition groups that represent quite a bit of political powers agreed to do so. We are waiting to hit a critical mass, and I think this dialogue is going to happen. But in the absence of support from the GCC and NATO countries, primarily the United States, Britain, and France, in the absence of support for such dialogue, with the increasing agitation to actually produce a civil war in Syria, this is criminal.
Okay, stand by. Let me get Besma here. Let me get Besma here. I saw Elliot Abrams on TV the other day, the former Bush administration foreign policy advisor, say it's time to arm the rebels. You don't necessarily have to bring NATO planes in and do a Libyan approach, but arm the rebels and that'll get things going. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I disagree. I mean, I think that we want to see less violence, less conflict, and by that we want to diffuse the situation. I think we need to focus on who's arming the regime. What I'd like to see is actually a pressure bear put on the Russians and the Chinese, who continue to either support him or, in the case of the Russians, send him literally brand new arms and shipments. We're seeing civilian planes being used to actually bring in arms into places like Haman Homs. I mean, we need to stop that end of things. We need to put pressure on the regime. We need to make it very loud and clear that those who continue to perpetuate these crimes in his regime will be facing things like the International Criminal Court. I mean, we need to put that kind of pressure on the regime and not, I think, ratchet up the conflict by actually bringing in all this.
Okay, Afra, having said that, you know, there's no indication that China or Russia is going to, you know, yield on these kinds of things. They've got very different ideas about how to handle the Syrian file, in which case, would you support arming the rebels?
Well, I mean, the problem is not complicated in Syria. As I said, I mean, there is the possibility for a peaceful transition of power, a transfer of power very gradually and beautifully if we have the president accept to step down. I mean, he is putting the entire country into a very dangerous situation by not willing to step down.
If he doesn't, what's the alternative?
The alternative is that, you know, he is also facing a dead end. He is choosing to end like Gaddafi, and then the Syrian people will win, but at a very high cost. People always win. When a people decide to rebel, they win. But the question is about the cost. So why don't we spare ourselves this dead end that Assad is facing, and also the high cost of democracy and freedom that the Syrians are willing to pay?
I'm down to less than 2 minutes, and I need to ask Christopher this. Christopher, let me ask Christopher this. Christopher, you are here tonight on our program defending a regime which basically most countries in the world think is a criminal regime right now. Are you?
Sure.
Tell me why you're comfortable taking that position.
Because the people in Syria are supporting the regime. And I'm not about to sit here in Ottawa and say, you guys don't count, and I've got to listen to the so-called all these countries of the world. It's up to the Syrian people, Steve, to judge the regime, to cooperate with the regime, to take the trust away or give the trust to the regime. It's up to them to decide. It's not up to some thugs and terrorists that are supported by the United States, Britain, and France to go, and the GCC, to go and decide for 24 million Syrians.
Atif, I literally have 30 seconds. Atif, 30 seconds left.
I think there is a colonial dynamic here and narrative. It should be left to the Syrian people. You cannot bomb them into democracy.
Absolutely.
And not with the help of Al-Qaeda. We need to give the Syrians the chance. Why is it always that the stick is reserved for the Arabs and the carrots for everybody else? This is a time when we should all call for debate, for dialogue, for bringing the parties together. It is totally unacceptable and is false to believe that the Assad is one person there. We have really the army sticking with him. We have
I've got to jump in. I said 30 seconds, and that's my time.
Coalition of parties.
Forgive me, that's my time. Afra Jalabi from the Syrian National Council, Christopher Assad in our nation's capital, Atif Kabursi from McMaster University, Besma Momani from CG here in the studio in Toronto, along with former Liberal MP Omar Al-Ghabra. A passionate issue about which there are very strong views, no doubt, but I thank all of you for coming on our program tonight and sharing those views with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.